Chapter 18. Dani looked over at where the two boys, one man and one boy, sat on the bow of the boat, talking as Zach showed Mark how to do something with his fishing line. She was lying across the seat near the back of the boat, enjoying having someone else keep an eye on Mark for a little while. She'd fished with them for a bit, but she soon realized they didn't need her, and it would do them both some good to have some one-on-one time. She'd claimed boredom, pulled her book from her bag, and went to the back and stretched out. She caught bits of conversation, but not enough to tell what they were talking about, only a word here or there. A glance at her watch told her they'd been out here for several hours, which surprised her. She would have guessed it had been maybe 2. "Are you guys getting hungry?" she called. Zach looked back at her and smiled. Her heart skipped a beat and her chest ached a little as she caught the joy in his pale blue eyes. "What time is it?" "Almost 1. "Oh wow." Zach turned to Mark, glanced at their poles, then turned back. "We'll be right there." While she waited, she pulled out the package of wet wipes she'd brought. She'd learned when Mark was a baby how handy they were, especially when there wasn't a sink for washing hands. "This is fun, Mom," Mark said as he climbed down the stairs from the bow and sat next to her. "That's good." She handed him a wipe. "Here, clean your hands before you eat." She pulled out a second and handed it to Zach without thinking about it, before using another on her own hands. "All right, turkey and mayo or peanut butter and grape?" Zach asked as he tucked his used wipe into the trash bag near the helm. An ice chest seemed to come from nowhere, and it took her a minute to realize he'd pulled it from the foot space in front of the passenger seat. "You said grape, right?" "I did." "Then I'll have peanut butter," Mark said. Zach handed him a baggie with a sandwich in it, then turned to look at Dani. "I'll take a turkey," she said, then took the sandwich as he passed it to her. He pulled a third sandwich out and took a seat. They were all quiet as they ate, at least everyone but Mark. He chattered about the water, the lake, the fish, and more, until he finished his sandwich. "That was good. Are there more?" "There are." "Open the cooler and look," Zach said. Dani watched the interaction between the two, and couldn't be happier. Zach seemed to be genuinely interested in getting to know and caring for their son, and Mark seemed to like him. That would help once they told him the truth. She knew that was coming fast. She didn't know how she'd break the news, just that she would need to. Mark opened the cooler and stood frozen a moment as he started into the depths, then looked back up at Zach, his eyes wide and his mouth hanging open. Dani wondered what was in there to cause that reaction. "You brought Mountain Dew?" Mark said. The odd look on his face made it seem like he didn't believe his eyes when he'd seen it. Soda wasn't something she kept around or allowed him to have often. She knew it was no big deal to most kids, they got them all the time, but Mark didn't. She let him have water and tea, once in a while juice, but rarely soda. She saw it as empty calories and chemicals that had no purpose. "I did. Do you want one?" "Can I?" Mark turned to Dani for permission. "I guess one." "Wow. Thanks, Mom." Mark lurched at her and gave her a big hug, the soda temporarily forgotten. She couldn't help but smile. She loved that he was sweet and sometimes still liked to cuddle against her, even though he was getting so big and she knew it would end soon. "Do you want one?" Zach asked her. He probably remembered that it had once been her drink of choice, above all else, but she hadn't had one in so long she wasn't sure she would even like it anymore. "Why not?" she said. "Hand one to your mom," Zach instructed Mark as he stood next to the cooler, "and give me one too." Mark handed out plastic bottles, then took one for himself, twisted the top and took a sip. Dani knew he would sip it slowly and make it last all afternoon. "Do you still want another sandwich?" Zach asked him. "Oh yeah. I do." Mark got back into the ice chest and chose a baggie before dropping the lid. Zach had to remind him to close it all the way to keep things cold, and in response, Mark sat on the cooler, shutting the lid with his weight. Dani shook her head and rolled her eyes. Mark was sweet, but he was still all boy. After they finished eating, she slathered Mark with sunscreen again before he and Zach went back to the bow to continue their fishing. She redid her own sunscreen, then lay back with her book, deciding to doze for a while in the sunshine.